The baddest dog in Harlem. We were all sitting around on the rail outside of Big Joe's place, trying to figure out which was the best fighter of all time. We'd had this conversation before, but what got everybody mad this time was Willie Murphy. Willie was in his 30s, or maybe even older, and was the kind of guy who thought that just because he was old, it meant he knew more than anybody. You have to go with Joe Louis being the best fighter of all time, Willie said. Joe held the championship for longer than anybody. That's because he didn't have to face Ali, Tommy said. How about Roberto Duran? Pedro was sitting on a folding chair that was chained to the gate that covered Big Joe's place. Duran's not a heavyweight, Willie said. When you talk about the greatest fighter of all time, you have to talk about heavyweights. Why? That's what I said. Because you do, Willie answered. Now that was a lame answer, and everybody there, with the exception of Willie, knew it. The conversation was getting to be stupid, and I knew it was going to get worse because Mr. Lynch was coming down the street. Mr. Lynch was so old he had washed dishes at the Last Supper. Whatever you said, he would bring up something from 1,000 years ago that nobody ever heard about. What you young people talking about? Mr. Lynch motioned for Pedro to get off the chair. These know-nothing kids thinking Ali could have taken Joe Louis. Willie started flapping his lips again. Ali couldn't have taken Joe Louis if Joe was fighting with a paper bag over his head. Ain't none of them could beat Jack Johnson, Mr. Lynch said, parking his old butt on the chair. Jack Johnson was the champion of the world, and he fought all over the world. Ali would have eat him up, Willie went on. Now that's one thing I know. Just when I was heated up enough to go upside Willie's head, we heard this squealing on the corner, and we looked up and saw two police cars come tearing around the corner. They pulled up right in front of us, and the cops come out with their guns out. Now, I wasn't a fool, and I knew when the police come tearing like that, they're looking for somebody. I did just like everybody else leaning on that rail did, said a quick prayer, and put on my innocent face. One of the cops came over to us. How long you guys been here? 2 hours, maybe 3 hours, Pedro said. Except for Mr. Lynch. He just got here. The cop took a glance at Mr. Lynch. Then he went over to Willie and started patting him down. Willie just stood there, and I hoped he didn't have anything on him illegal. Then the cop asked him how long he had been there, and Willie told him the same as Pedro did, except for Mr. Lynch. We had all been there about 2 hours. Then I saw an officer pointing to one of the buildings, and when he did that, all the cops got around behind their cars and started crouching down as if they were expecting some heavy shooting. Hey, we're going to move on down the street, Tommy called out to the cops. You stay right where you are, this big cop called out, and he meant it too. Then the next thing we did was to look up at the building to see if we could spot anybody shooting. Now, I figured if there was a crazy dude up there shooting at people, he was liable to shoot at us instead of whoever he was mad at. Hey, man, we sit in ducks here on this rail, Willie said, and I'm sitting here on the end. You're lucky, I said. If it is some crazy fool, he's liable to be aiming at you and hit one of us. At least if he hits you first, it'll give us a chance to duck. Hey, Mr. Officer, Pedro called out. We got to get away from here before we get shot up. The cop looked over at us and didn't say nothing. I bet if he had his way, he would have had us sitting out there in the police car. Some more cop cars came, and before you turned around, there's about 7 cars and a whole mess of people milling around 145th Street, trying to figure out what was going on. Then the kids started coming around, and everybody was looking up at the windows where the cops were looking. One thing about 145th Street, half the guys on the block don't have jobs, and so they're always on the stoops or just standing around with nothing to do. And after a while, that gets boring. So when the cops arrive like this, it breaks the day up nice. Unless it's you they're looking for, of course. Junior, Junior, old Mrs. Davis come running out of the laundromat with her fat self. Junior, Junior, get back there. Things were getting out of hand, and the police tried to get people to move across the street. One of them got on the bullhorn and told all the kids to get off the street immediately. He must have meant that as a joke. The kids didn't have anything to do, and they weren't going anyplace. So you had the kids just standing there looking at the cops, and then you had Mrs. Davis moaning and going on about where Junior was. Junior is a wino who does little odd jobs around the block, but anytime any trouble goes down, his mama starts running around screaming for him like he's 4 or 5 years old. There's somebody up there, a kid yelled. Now, what did he say that out for? Everybody hit the ground, including me, and covered up the best they could. I hadn't seen anything, but then I wasn't looking too hard. The thing I don't want to be is a witness. Once I got on the ground, I figured I was going to stay on the ground until the mess was over with. But then I saw Willie sliding on his belly down the way and into the Ease On In, the little soul food place. I went right behind him, and soon we all on the floor of the restaurant. What's going on? Mammy, the girl who worked there, asked when all these guys come crawling into the restaurant. The cops are looking for somebody, I said. You better get on down here on the floor next to me so I can protect you. Flood, the manager, was eating a sandwich, and he just slid down to the floor and kept on eating. Right then, a policeman came in and told everybody to get down. He was crouching, and the rest of us were down on the floor on our bellies, and he was telling us to get down. What's going on out there? Mammy asked. We got a report of a man with an automatic weapon, this cop said. Anybody here know anything about it? We all said no, and then the cop eased out. What they mean about some automatic weapon? Pedro asked. It means when it hits your butt, you're automatically dead, Mommy said, and she got a good laugh out of that. That laugh that Mammy got lasted about a good 10 seconds when all of a sudden we heard another one of them big-eyed kids saying something about seeing somebody at a window. We stuck our heads up a little so we could see what was going on. One of the cops started running around the front of the car and slipped on some dog dew. When he hit the ground, his gun went off and a shot came through the window of the restaurant. There was glass all over the floor and Willie let out a scream. By this time, the cops were shooting away at that window. There must have been maybe 100 shots, and people was running and screaming. One cop went down behind a car, and when Mammy looked, she said he was bleeding. They got him in the head, she called out. The mess was getting serious. Willie was bleeding right next to me, and now the cop was shot in the head. I slid over to the counter and started to get behind it. We don't allow nobody behind the counter, Flood said. You know that. Outside, the shooting started again, and I squinched under the counter the best I could. Mammy got down next to me, and I put my arm around her, and she snuggled up. After a while, the shooting stopped, and I heard somebody outside say, They got the guy with the automatic weapon, and it was some Arab. We waited for a while, and then started getting up from the floor. I stayed behind the counter in case it broke out again. Then we all kind of edged around outside to see what we could see. I looked around. No cops had been shot, but the guy who had slipped in the dog dew was having his elbow looked at. We heard somebody shout, and everybody hit the ground again. But then we saw that it was just Mary Brown. Mary is one of those smart sisters who has a good job downtown. She pointed up to the window that the cops had shot out. You shot up my new drapes. I don't work all day for you fools to be up here shooting up my drapes. Who lives in that apartment with you? This cop with some gold braid on his hat said. Nobody, Mary said. Where's your boyfriend? The cop asked. I don't know where he is, Mary said, but wherever he is, he's not messing up my new drapes. If he's up there, they just killed him, somebody said. Let's go, lady, this cop said. Then he went to take Mary by the arm. She snatched it away from him, and she said she wasn't going anywhere with them unless she had a black man with her. She started looking around for somebody to go with her when a cop grabbed me by the arm and said, You come with us. Hey, why I gotta go? I asked. I don't know anything. I don't want to see no dead people. Didn't do a bit of good because they made me go up there with them. My knees were shaking and I had to pee so bad I didn't know what to do. Mary was going up the stairs like she was in a hurry to get somewhere. The cops made us go up first and they came behind. I tried to turn around and they gave me a push in the small of the back, but I saw they had their guns out and they were looking more tense with every step. They had one cop who was a brother, but he was trailing behind and looked like he was fixing to run any minute. When we got to the floor where Mary lived, I held my breath and closed my eyes. If I was going to die, I sure didn't want to see it coming. Mary went to her door and started fishing out her keys, and the cops stood on either side of the door. She unlocked the door, and then the cops eased me and her back. Then they hit the door and rushed in. What I saw when they let me in was something I will never forget as long as I live. There's about a couple thousand bullet holes all over the room. The ceiling was all shot up from where the cops had been shooting from the street. The window was all shot up. Her drapes were raggedy. The refrigerator was shot up. The stove was shot up. The kitchen cabinet was shot up. She had a box of salt that was so shot up as all over the room. But that wasn't the worst part of it. Right in the middle of the floor was her dog, deader than a doornail. I don't know how he could have got himself so shot up like that. They must have hit him once, and then he didn't know what to do with himself and kept trying to get back in front of the window. You killed my dog. Mary put her hands over her face and let out a long wail. You killed my dog? Mary sat on the side of the bed that wasn't covered with plaster and began to cry. The cops just looked for a while, and then they started getting themselves together. That dog looked like a terrorist to me, one of them said. You could see they were breathing easy again. That's probably the baddest dog in Harlem. That's what the cop who was a brother said. How are we going to write this up? One cop asked. He had got there after everybody else, but you could tell he was a boss. I know one thing, Mary said. Somebody's going to pay me for this, and that's the truth. I'm going to sue the city. We all felt a little better about things then, and I was glad I was the one that went up with Mary so I could tell the others. We were just at the top of the stairs, fixing to go down again, when the first cop stopped quick, and I looked to see what he was looking at. He was standing a few feet from the door at the end of the hall. It was open just a little. The cops looked at each other, and the guns came out again. The routine was the same as Mary's place. They called out for anybody that was in there to come out. When nobody came out, two cops wearing bulletproof vests rushed the door. 5 or 6 cops went in behind the first two, and there was someone shouting inside, and then nothing. Then one by one, the cops came out. Their faces were pale. Something was wrong, big time. They whispered something to the officer in charge, and he nodded. Some of the cops started downstairs with Mary. One stayed behind and leaned against the wall. I pointed toward the door, and the cop shrugged. I went to the apartment and pushed the door open. It was a one-room place like Mary had. It wasn't shot up near as bad as her place. A few bullet holes were here and there. A catsup bottle busted up on the floor. Then I looked at the bed and saw the kid. He was a little knotty-headed boy with lips that stuck out like he was pouting, and skinny black legs that twisted oddly away from his body. The television was on with the sound turned down. The way I seen it, the boy was home watching cartoons when he heard all the noise outside, and he must have turned down the TV and went to the window to see what was happening. I didn't see where he was hit, but I saw all the blood on the bed, and it didn't take a lot of figuring to see he wasn't breathing. A feeling came over me, like I was lying on a beach at the edge of a lost world with a wave of hurt washing over my body. I looked at that kid's face again. He could have been my little brother or cousin, and I wanted to say something to him, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. I covered him up, went on outside, and closed the door behind me. The cops took Mary downtown to make some kind of statement, and I went on down to the street. I knew what I wanted was to hear Pedro and Willie and Tommy and all the other brothers and sisters on the block talking about that kid. I wanted them to say how bad they felt about it and what a shame it was the way life could slip away so easily in Harlem, in our community, on our street. Maybe when we got together and let our pain out, it would rise up and reach someplace where the kid could feel it too. I don't know if any of that made sense, but it was how I felt. Is it true what they said about shooting a dog? Willie asked. He took my arm and looked into my face. I didn't have to tell him there was more to it.